The United States has refused to renew the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement in its current form, and Canada is now facing one of the most consequential trade negotiations in its modern history. But there is an important detail behind the headlines. CUSMA has not been cancelled, it has not suddenly disappeared, and Canada is not waking up today without a trade agreement with the United States. Instead, Washington has rejected the automatic extension of the agreement, opening the door to a much more difficult renegotiation while CUSMA remains in force. That distinction matters enormously, because what is happening now is not the end of North American free trade. It is the beginning of a high-stakes battle over what North American trade will look like for the next decade. On July 1, 2026, the United States formally declined to renew CUSMA in its current form. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said Washington would continue engaging with Canada and Mexico to address what the administration calls shortcomings in the agreement and the trade deficits the United States runs with both countries. Canada and Mexico, by contrast, had indicated that they wanted the agreement extended for another 16 years. Canada had already formally requested renewal. So the three countries entered the review with very different objectives. Canada wanted stability, Mexico wanted continuity, Washington wanted leverage. And that difference has now transformed what was supposed to be a routine review into a potentially major confrontation. To understand why, we need to go back to what CUSMA actually is. CUSMA is the Canadian name for the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In the United States, it is called USMCA. It replaced NAFTA and entered into force in 2020. The agreement governs an enormous amount of economic activity across North America. Automobiles, agriculture, energy, manufacturing, services, supply chains, food, consumer products, industrial components, and thousands of businesses that move goods across borders every day. The entire North American economy has been built around these integrated supply chains. A vehicle assembled in Canada might contain components produced in the United States and Mexico. A Canadian manufacturer might depend on American machinery. An American factory might depend on Canadian aluminum. A Mexican plant might depend on parts crossing the border multiple times before a finished product is completed. That is why trade policy between these three countries is different from a normal tariff dispute. The borders are not simply dividing three independent economies. They are running through one deeply integrated industrial system, and that is exactly why the current dispute is so important. The United States is not simply asking Canada to lower one tariff. Washington is pushing for changes to the broader economic relationship. The Trump administration has repeatedly focused on trade deficits, rules of origin, industrial production, supply chains, and what it describes as unfair treatment of American companies. U.S. negotiators have also been pushing for North American supply chains to become less dependent on countries outside the region. That was already visible in U.S.-Mexico negotiations earlier this year, where Washington focused on rules of origin, automotive production, steel and aluminum, and economic security. And Canada knows that these negotiations are happening against a much larger background. Tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, automotive trade, steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, agriculture, and the political relationship between Ottawa and Washington. This is why Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has been taking a much tougher approach than previous governments might have taken. Canada cannot simply assume that the old rules will continue forever. At the same time, Ottawa cannot afford to casually sacrifice access to the American market. The numbers are too large. The United States remains Canada's overwhelmingly dominant trading partner. Millions of Canadian jobs are connected directly or indirectly to trade with America. Entire industries have been built around access to the U.S. market. That gives Washington enormous leverage. But Canada has leverage too. And that is where this confrontation becomes interesting. Canada is not simply another country negotiating with the United States. It is deeply integrated into the American economy. Canada supplies energy, critical minerals, agricultural products, industrial materials, electricity, automotive components, and other resources that American businesses and consumers depend upon. The relationship is therefore not one-sided. A major disruption would hurt Canada, but it would also impose costs on the United States. And those costs are already becoming visible. Canada has been facing U.S. tariffs on important sectors. Steel and aluminum have been particularly sensitive. Automobiles have also become a major issue. The result is that CUSMA negotiations are happening alongside an active tariff dispute. That makes the situation much more dangerous, because tariffs can be used as leverage during negotiations. And once tariffs begin changing, companies have to make decisions. Do they raise prices? Do they absorb the cost? Do they move production? Do they switch suppliers? Do they delay investment? Or do they simply stop serving a particular market? That uncertainty can be almost as damaging as the tariff itself, and businesses hate uncertainty. That is why the July 1st decision was so important. CUSMA contains a joint review mechanism. The agreement was designed so that the three countries would periodically assess whether they wanted to extend it. If all three agreed, the agreement could be extended for another 16 years. If they did not, the agreement would continue under an annual review process. Canada and Mexico said they wanted renewal. The United States did not. That means CUSMA remains in force, but the long-term guarantee has become much less certain. Canada now has to negotiate in an environment where the possibility of a future breakdown is constantly hanging over the market, and Washington knows that. This is the leverage the Trump administration is trying to use. Instead of simply accepting the existing agreement, Washington can say, if you want long-term certainty, we want changes. That could include tougher rules of origin, changes to automotive trade, greater American access to Canadian markets, changes involving agriculture, and measures designed to reduce America's trade deficit. The United States has already been pursuing similar objectives in its discussions with Mexico. But Canada presents a different challenge. Canada's economy is much smaller than America's, its population is much smaller, its domestic market cannot simply replace the American market overnight. That means Ottawa has to be careful. A dramatic escalation could hurt Canadian consumers and businesses, but excessive concessions could also create political problems at home, and that is the balancing act Mark Carney now faces. The Canadian government has been trying to show that it is willing to negotiate without appearing willing to surrender. That distinction has become increasingly important. On August 6th, Canadian officials met with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer in Washington. Canada described the meeting as constructive and detailed, with discussions focused on establishing a comprehensive trade agreement and resolving sectoral tariff issues. That is a significant development, because despite the aggressive rhetoric, the two sides are still talking. They have not walked away. They are not operating under a trade embargo. And CUSMA itself remains in force, but the negotiations are becoming more urgent because another deadline is approaching. The United States has been threatening additional tariffs on Canadian goods. Recent reporting indicates that Canada and the United States have been discussing possible concessions to prevent new tariffs scheduled for August 19th. Those discussions have reportedly included issues such as automobiles, dairy market access, and American alcohol sales in Canada, while Canada has been seeking relief from some existing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. That tells us something important. The SUMSA review is no longer just about what happens years from now. It is connected to immediate economic decisions. A company deciding today whether to invest millions of dollars in a Canadian factory cannot simply ignore the possibility that its access to the American market could change. An American manufacturer cannot ignore the possibility that Canadian components may become more expensive. A Canadian farmer cannot ignore changes in agricultural access. And an American consumer cannot ignore the possibility that tariffs eventually appear in retail prices. That is why this is becoming a North American economic story rather than simply a Canadian diplomatic story. The United States also has reasons to avoid a full-scale trade breakdown. American industries depend heavily on Canadian inputs. The auto sector is particularly integrated. Energy is another major example. Canada is a critical supplier to the United States, and disrupting that relationship would create costs on both sides. So Washington has leverage, but Ottawa is not powerless. Canada can retaliate. It can diversify. It can strengthen relationships with Europe and Asia. It can encourage domestic production. It can develop new export infrastructure. And perhaps most importantly, it can begin treating economic dependence on the United States as a strategic vulnerability. That shift has already been happening. Canadian businesses and policymakers have spent the past year asking a question that would have sounded extreme only a few years ago. What happens if the American market is no longer as reliable as it once was? That question is now central to Canada's economic strategy, and it could have consequences far beyond CUSMA. If Canadian companies begin permanently diversifying away from the United States, some of the trade flows that have existed for decades could change. That does not happen overnight. But investment decisions made today can shape supply chains for decades. A company that builds a new factory in Canada may be thinking about 20 or 30 years of production. If American tariff policy is unpredictable, companies may build elsewhere. That is why trade agreements matter. They create confidence. They allow businesses to plan. They reduce the political risks surrounding investment, and that is exactly what is now being placed under pressure. The United States, however, has its own domestic political calculations. President Trump has repeatedly argued that the United States should use its economic power more aggressively. The administration views trade deficits as evidence that existing arrangements are not producing enough benefits for American workers and industries. Washington also wants stronger North American rules that encourage manufacturing inside the region. That does not necessarily mean the United States wants CUSMA to disappear. In fact, the opposite may be true. The current strategy appears to be using the threat of uncertainty to force changes while keeping the basic agreement alive. That is why describing the situation simply as the U.S. canceled CUSMA would be misleading. It did not. The agreement remains in force. The United States rejected renewal in its current form. Those are two very different things, and that distinction could become one of the most important facts in the entire story. Because the negotiations now have time, but they also have pressure. Every year that the agreement enters another review creates another opportunity for conflict. Canada therefore wants to secure as much certainty as possible. Washington wants to extract concessions. Mexico is also negotiating its own relationship with the United States. And all three countries are watching what happens in the other two bilateral relationships. This creates a complicated triangle. The United States can negotiate separately with Canada and Mexico. Canada can coordinate with Mexico. Mexico can use its own economic leverage. And all three countries know that North American supply chains work best when the rules are predictable across the entire continent. If Washington pushes too hard against Canada, Canada could respond. If Canada makes concessions that Washington likes, Mexico will be watching. And if Mexico receives favorable terms, Canada will want to know why it is being treated differently. That makes the negotiations extremely difficult. There is also a geopolitical dimension. North America is competing economically with Europe and Asia. China remains a major manufacturing power. The United States wants to reduce dependence on Chinese supply chains. That means Canada and Mexico are strategically valuable. Canada has enormous natural resources. Mexico has a large manufacturing workforce and geographic proximity to the United States. Together, Canada, the United States, and Mexico have the potential to build a highly integrated continental manufacturing system. But that only works if the three countries trust the rules. If businesses begin to believe that tariffs can change suddenly, the economic advantage of North American integration becomes weaker. And this is where Canada's strategy becomes especially important. Ottawa is increasingly talking about economic diversification, not because Canada can replace the United States overnight. It cannot. But because Canada wants alternatives, more trade with Europe, more trade with Asia, more domestic processing of resources, more investment in critical minerals, more infrastructure connecting Canadian resources to global markets, and potentially greater trade among Canadian provinces themselves. The goal is not necessarily to abandon America. The goal is to make sure Canada has options, and that may be the most powerful long-term consequence of the current dispute. If the United States uses CUSMA negotiations to force Canada into a more dependent relationship, it could eventually produce the opposite result. It could encourage Canada to diversify faster. That does not mean Washington loses. The United States remains Canada's largest market by an enormous margin, but dependence is a two-way strategic calculation. Canada wants to reduce its vulnerability. America wants to increase its bargaining power. Those two objectives are now colliding, and that is why the next few months matter. The August 19th tariff deadline is one immediate pressure point. The broader CUSMA review is another. And every negotiation between Ottawa and Washington will be watched closely by businesses across North America. If Canada and the United States reach a comprehensive arrangement, the crisis could begin to ease. If they fail, tariffs could rise, retaliation could return, and companies could begin accelerating supply chain diversification. The worst-case scenario would not necessarily be a dramatic overnight collapse. It could be something much slower. A gradual erosion of confidence. One company moves production, another delays investment, a third signs a new supplier contract somewhere else, a fourth begins selling into Europe instead of the United States. And after several years, the North American economic structure looks different. That is how trade wars can permanently reshape economies, not through one spectacular announcement, but through thousands of individual business decisions. So where does Canada stand right now? It is negotiating, it is pushing back, it is seeking tariff relief, and it is preparing for a world in which the old assumption of permanent North American trade stability can no longer be taken for granted. The United States has not ended CUSMA, but Washington has made it clear that it will not simply extend the agreement without changes. Canada wants renewal. The United States wants renegotiation. And that disagreement is now the central economic conflict between the two countries. The next question is whether the two sides can turn that conflict into a new agreement, or whether the pressure will continue to escalate. For Canada, the stakes could hardly be higher. The country needs access to its largest market, but it also needs economic sovereignty. It needs investment, it needs stable supply chains, and it needs a strategy for dealing with the United States that is increasingly willing to use tariffs as a negotiating weapon. For Washington, the stakes are equally significant. The United States wants better terms, it wants stronger domestic manufacturing, it wants North American supply chains to serve American economic and security interests, but it also needs Canada, it needs Canadian resources, it needs Canadian energy, it needs integrated manufacturing, and it needs a stable northern border. That is the paradox at the heart of this confrontation. Canada needs America, America needs Canada, and both governments know it. The question is who will blink first. The latest talks suggest neither side is ready to walk away. Canadian officials describe the August 6th meeting as constructive, but constructive does not mean resolved. Major disagreements remain, and with additional tariff threats still hanging over Canadian exports, the pressure is only increasing. So this is not yet the end of CUSMA. It is something potentially more consequential. It is the beginning of a negotiation over what replaces the assumptions that have governed North American trade for decades. The United States has rejected the easy path. Canada is refusing to simply accept whatever Washington demands, and now both countries have to decide how much economic pain they are willing to absorb to get the deal they want. If they succeed, North America could emerge with a stronger, more integrated trade system. If they fail, the damage could spread through factories, farms, ports, supply chains, and consumer markets on both sides of the border, and that is why the CUSMA showdown deserves attention. Because this is not just about a trade agreement, it is about who controls the economic future of North America. The United States has made its position clear, Canada has made its position clear. Now the negotiations begin in earnest, and the next move could determine whether North American trade enters a new era of cooperation or a prolonged era of tariffs, retaliation, and uncertainty.